Chapter 9. Queen Mildred walked with them as they went to explore the herds.
We are immensely proud of the extensive breeding and training program that makes our horses the best of the best. The pick is yours.
She motioned to include the entire royal herd as they walked.
Remember that the horse you pick has to be suited for your needs. If you do not think you'll be riding in war, I would not pick our war horses. Princess Mathilde knows your personalities and will help you find your partner. A knight is only as strong as their horse. I would recommend an animal at least 4 years of age and no older than 7.
She nodded to hostlers, waiting to help them. Luca joined them as the long day of trying horses began. Mathilde stood alone in the middle of the herd of loose horses, chatting with them. She explored their minds and suggested ones for the hostlers to saddle up, horse after horse, for them to test ride. Adeline declined a war horse and instead chose a gelding, slightly too large to be a proper lady's palfrey. He had been bred for war, but his spirit was too genteel. When she mounted him and rode him around, the two worked very well together. She liked how quickly he reacted to her aids, and he told Mathilde he liked the fact that she did not use spurs. Evelyn chose a palfrey as well, a dainty little gelding. Niall wanted to explore Atrulla once their training was mostly complete. A hardy mountain mare was his choice. She was feisty enough that other travelers would give him a wide berth, but with strong feet so she could go anywhere. Mathilde was standing, chatting to the horses, when she felt a deep throbbing presence behind her.
Mathilde,
Whispered the voice. She turned around to see an ethereal light surrounding a small chestnut pony. When she peeked at the others, she knew the goddess had chosen to appear to her alone.
Windrunner, I am honored.
Mathilde bowed to the horse goddesses, who ruffled her braid with her lips. It was true that the human gods and goddesses did have animals they had created, but when they created them, they first created the animal god who then made the mortal offspring.
Child, you have done so well so far. Soon the true test of your powers will begin. Pick a wise mount, child, for you do not need a battling horse.
Mathilde cautiously brought her hands up to stroke them through the goddess's thick, coarse hair as she breathed warm breath on her, until she faded away. Mathilde glanced around and saw only Niall watching her with a grin. He winked at her. Keeping the goddess's words in mind, she began to explore until she came to the hardy ponies. An average-sized black pony nickered at her, and Mathilde approached her with a hand extended to touch her on the middle of the head. The mare's eyes closed, and Mathilde gasped at the connection.
Mine,
Whispered the mare, and Mathilde crooned at her. The mare lowered herself down to the ground, and Mathilde swung onto her bare back. She rocked back and forth while the mare stood, and then she rode off, using her thighs to grip. She tested her balance and their response times together. Mathilde never had a problem riding, but this pony was quick and sure-footed, and Mathilde fell in love quickly. Mathilde rode her back and swung down off her, and with a nudge of her mind the mare trotted off. She joined the others watching Aubrey test out how the big chesty warhorse she had chosen. A fine-looking brown mare who was responsive and very obedient, the perfect knight's horse. Celine was going from horse to horse, but none were suiting her. They had moved into the corrals, and she simply could not pick one. Suddenly Bronco snorts and grunts came from the next corral over, where they were breaking the 3-year-old horses. Or in this case, trying to. Celine watched as a hostler was pitched hard from the back of a black stallion. His nostrils were flared, and he looked insanely wild. At the second the hostler hit the ground, other hostlers had to chase the horse off with whips so he would not trample anyone. Frothed at the neck and mouth, he was wicked. His eyes showed no fear, only pure anger at the audacity of man to ride him. Lucas saw her watching, and spoke loud enough for all of them to hear. Very well bred, but he's positively wild. No one can ride him, and he has been in training for several months. The rest of the horses his age had already moved into advanced training. We've tried everything with him, but it's getting to the point where we might have to cull him, he said.
I want him,
Celine said. Queen Mildred blinked at her.
My dear, his bloodlines won't make up for the fact that he's untamable.
Celine shrugged as she dismounted off the mare she had been on.
I don't want him tame,
She proclaimed as she walked to the corral. She climbed over the fence so she could sit on the fence, where the colt was now racing around like a mad horse, his reins trailing on the ground.
What you think, Mathilde?
Celine asked as Mathilde leaned beside her to watch him. Mathilde's brow furrowed.
He says he loves bucking people off. He's not in pain or scared, he just enjoys it.
Celine snickered as the hostlers tried to herd him up, but his ears were laid back and he chased at them before trotting towards Mathilde. He stopped several steps away and struck at the ground, snorting and squealing, his ears still pinned. He charged her. Mathilde swept forward, bearing down on him with her powers. That still did not stop him, but it kept him from biting her, although he snapped his teeth in front of her. She caught his reins and gave a firm tug when he stepped too close to her. You will not make me submit. His presence was strong and loud and boomed at her as she tried to chase away her influence. She did not allow him to intimidate her.
How will you ever get in battle if you keep bucking everyone off?
He snorted his derision at her. I can battle by myself. Mathilde rolled her eyes.
Nay, you can't. You need a partner.
She felt rather than heard his disgust, but then Celine reached out and took the reins from her.
Celine!
The stud colt yanked away, shooting backwards fast. Celine followed him, barely keeping from being dragged in front of him. She was not angry, and she was not yanking. She just followed him until he hit his butt hard into the railing.
Is he handsome?
She crooned out to him as she tried to bolt forward over the top of her. She flicked her arms forward with a firm hiss. He went around her, and she stepped into his hip, so when he tried to run forward, he caught himself in the mouth and was forced to turn. She continued with this until he and she were panting in a dust storm from their angry dance. He stopped, facing her, his sides heaving, ears pinned. Celine simply stood there. When she stepped forward, he stepped away, so she continued until he once again hit the railing. He blew out with annoyance. She approached again, and this time he stood still, allowing her to pat his ragged neck. He wasn't well groomed because rarely could someone touch him. His mouth froth was mixed with blood from yanking on his own mouth so hard. Celine slid the reins over his neck.
Celine, if you break a bone, I'm not healing it,
Adeline called out nervously. Celine ignored her, but shortened one rein and prepared to swing onto his back. He snorted, then Celine was slammed into the back of the saddle as he took off bucking. She bent her elbows hard and kept that one rein bent. He fought her. She flew straight off him and hit the dirt hard. As she hit, she rolled so she came upright on one knee, keeping an eye out for him so she could roll out of the way when he charged. And when he did, it was with hesitation. She rolled to the side and was up and had the reins again. She did a squat, making him turn again as she repeated her pattern until he was again at the fence and she could mount. She fell off many times that day. Some people got bored and some people left, but the royal hostlers and Queen Mildred accepted that this wild horse was hers. The hostlers were relieved to not have to deal with him again. The Blessed was about to intervene, but the horse and Celine were both tired, dirty, and sweaty when she swung on for the last time. The horse bolted off, but this time half-heartedly, and Celine warily fought for his head, making him spin in circles again and again until he stopped his sides heaving. Celine didn't stay on him, but slid like a weak snake to the ground. She leaned against him, grinning triumphantly, and patted him on the shoulder.
There, wild one. Maybe if you behave yourself, we can go running one day,
She told him before she walked him out of the corral. Once in the barn, she pulled the saddle off his steaming back.
I tell you I'm sorry, but you did it to yourself,
She told him as she slung it onto the side of the stall to be cleaned. Her muscles were protesting as she turned back to the grumpy stallion and carefully she positioned him in the corner before she pulled off his bridle and replaced it with a halter. He half-heartedly bit at her as she changed it. Once she had him haltered, she tossed the rope over the side of the stall and dunked her currycomb in the water trough. She began to curry him down, keeping an eye on him as she did. He was watching her just as much as she rubbed him down, and narrowly avoided being kicked several times and bit twice. Finally done, she pulled off his halter and then hobbled over to open his stall to his individual paddock. When she turned around, it was to a very curious horse eyeballing her. Later, she would find out from Luca that the hostlers didn't dare stay in his stall without a halter on him, and they had to push him into a chute to halter and tack him up. She was too weary to be worried about being run over.
I don't intend on dominating your horse,
Her voice full of exhaustion as she crawled over the side of the stall and slithered to the other side.
We'll be partners and be in many battles together.
She forked him hay and then pulled his tack down to clean it. She was so tired that after cleaning it and shaking out his sweat-soaked saddle pad to dry, she could barely dunk herself in the trough to get the worst of the dust herself off before locating her bed. The last thing she remembered was hitting her pillow. She woke up around midnight, or so she thought based off the sounds from outside her tent again. She grinned to herself. Adults could sure be randy, and then groaned as she tried to roll over. Her very bones ached, and she was covered in bruises. But when she rolled over, she wasn't alone in bed. Adeline was nestled up to her, her body seeking the heat that always emanated from Celine. In her sleep, Adeline reached out and touched Celine's face. Instant hot and cold relief poured through her, and in her mind's eye, she saw Adeline giving her healing. She also could see from Adeline's subconscious that there was a bath and food for her after healing. It only took Adeline a minute for Celine's body to feel strong again. She dragged herself from her bed and carefully tucked Adeline in, for she was always chilly after healing. Celine whispered fire to the bath water and sank into it with a deep and raspy moan. She drank a tankard of cool watered wine and wolfed down large hunks of boar and rye bread with yellow cheese. As her muscles loosened in the bath, she fell asleep, waking some hours later aware that she was covered in a soaking wet sheet and Fidelius was laying her back in her bed with Adeline. She murmured her thanks, then fell back to sleep. Adeline woke her up with a nudge and a yawn at false dawn. Celine, the Queen said you had to care for your demon beast for all his needs, as he likes attack the hostlers. Celine gave a deep moan of protest before she dragged herself out of bed and dressed clumsily in the dark. As she walked to the barn, the other hostlers were awake and cheerful. The head hostler waved her over. So now that you've taken the demon, these are his rations. He motioned her towards his part of the chalked-up board. She rubbed her eyes and squinted at it. The stallion had no grain and only forage to his diet. He seemed so crazy I tried cutting him off of his grain to see if it would calm him down.
Was he any different when he had it? She asked him.
Nay. She gave a decisive shrug.
Maybe let us give him half a cup then? I can see if I can use it as a training tool.
The hostler nodded his permission and changed the board. Celine walked to her stallion's stall with his grain and peeked over the edge.
Morning, Grumpy,
she told him cheerfully, and his only acknowledgement was the pinning of his ears. She shook his bucket to get his attention.
If you want your oats, you gotta let me halter you.
20 minutes and a bite on her arm later, she had him haltered. After dumping his grain in the feed trough, she began to brush him. She curried the leftover sweat off him and checked his body for any sores. She couldn't help but be surprised for all the carrying on he did the other day. His back didn't hurt at all. She braved his mouth to check and noticed no injuries on his mouth. She picked out his feet and decided to take him to the round pen once she had him fully cared for. She slid a chain around his nose so he couldn't yank her around. Taking him outside, she had to wait until one of the hostlers was done with the young gelding. While doing so, she worked on some ground training with him, hoping that this would eventually mean he wouldn't have to fear being kicked in the head every time she went to handle him. Finally, when in the round pen, Celine tried to encourage some good behavior in the colt. For the most part, he had zero interest in being around her, but he didn't charge her, and as she took him back, the hostlers told her that was a sign, as he always charged people. By the time she made it back to the tents, she had seen many naked people, nobility and peasants dragging themselves into tents. This made her grin as she ducked her head down and kept walking past them. Fidelius and Helen were already up and scrambling eggs. Aubrey and Adeline were also awake. Celine slumped down on one of the low couches and took a piece of bread with a chunk of cheese. "How'd it go, m'lady?" Fidelius asked, as he took some hot eggs into a bread bowl and handed it to her.
It went fine. I like him. He seems fun,
she said around her eggs. She was starving. By the time they had finished their breakfast, Niall and Eblin had also dragged themselves out of their bedrooms and were ready for breakfast. Niall clumsily and with a great deal of exaggerated smacking, flopped beside Celine. "What's the plan?" he yawned, and eagerly accepted a plate from Fidelius. "You and Eblin have a training session with me," Fidelius told him. Niall moaned dramatically. I don't wanna. Why is no one else training with us?" "Not that it's any of your business, Trouble, but Mathilde has plans with the Queen. Aubrey and Celine have riding, and Adeline since studying with the royal healers. Which means that you, Evelyn, and I get one-on-one time." Fidelis did a full wicked grin, causing Niall to moan in horror and Evelyn to giggle. Not too far from the village, Mathilde was riding her mare, Belle, in one of the lightly forested areas. She was only thinking of what she and the Queen had been discussing, a marriage for the good of the people. Mildred had already several suitors for her hand, and she wanted Mathilde's input, but Mathilde's mind was pulled to the present when Belle jarred to a stop. Mathilde blinked several times and then looked down upon the little old woman standing in the path of her mare. Not a second had passed before Mathilde was happily friendly. She smiled at the older woman.
Hello, grandmother. Is there anything I can assist you with?
She slid down her horse to land on the ground and then shook her skirts out. Grandmother was a term of respect given to any elderly woman in the Heartlands, whether you were related or not. The respect one would give their grandparents was given to all elders. The old lady looked ancient in many ways, her hair white and frayed. When she smiled, only a few teeth showed. Although she was ancient, her brown eyes held a great deal of intelligence and mischief. Her skin had paled from what probably was once a dark brown to near ivory, she was so old.
Your Majesty.
She bobbed her head as her sore knees would not allow much of a curtsy.
Are you not late for a meeting with the Queen? Surely you have no time to help an old woman.
A dainty frown crossed Mathilde's face. She tried to remember if she had ever seen this woman before. Then she dismissed the suspicious thoughts. Although she didn't take herself as memorable as her fellow blessed, she was memorable enough to her own people.
Nonsense, grandmother. The health and happiness of my people has been the foremost concern of my life. Now, what do you need a hand with?
The old woman merely turned and walked off the path. Mathilde didn't pause, just followed with Belle, just onto the trees that was an old tent. So long it had been in the ground that weeds and vines were wrapped about it, nearly concealing it. The old woman lifted her arms in a shrug to indicate the tent, a milk cow in a small garden that was overrun with weeds. Mathilde set to work without further prompting. She pulled weeds from the small garden and then milked the cow using the pail waiting nearby, all the while chatting amicably with the cow. By the time she returned to the front of the tent, the old woman had made porridge on a small fire and was smoking a pipe. Carefully, Mathilde set the milk to straining and then sat on the ground, across the fire from the woman, and regarded her with serious brown eyes.
Grandmother, what is it you need from me? Truly need?
The old woman regarded her, puffing at her pipe. She offered Mathilde a bowl of plain porridge, which she took with a mutter of thanks.
Why do you not live with your people, grandmother? What would have stopped you from being with our people?
Mathilde prompted in the silence.
My daughter is buried in these woods,
The woman spoke, her voice still pleasant, though a nasty gleam was in her eyes. Mathilde turned her head and slowly searched the forest with her eyes until she seen a plain wood marking for a grave. Unlike the rest of the old woman's decrepit belongings, this was beautifully covered in flowers, and the grass kept trim.
I'm sorry for your loss. How did you lose her?
Mathilde asked politely.
She was raped and murdered by one of your lineage, Prince Lyriden.
The words were said a chill shot down Mathilde's spine, and she felt every hair on her body stand up as it dawned on her whose garden she had just weeded. At first anger flared in her eyes, and the witch who had placed a curse on her family, and something in Mathilde screamed for vengeance. About to open her mouth in anger, she hesitated and studied the woman again. She had to be centuries old, bound by her curse to remain alive until someone lifted it. Through those years she had mourned the loss of her only daughter, a young girl who had been violated by a fiendish prince of the Heartlands. So great was her pain that when Prince Lyriten's parents, the king and queen, refused to discipline their son, the witch cursed the royal family. Although bitterness filled her, Mathilde also felt a small start of pain, pure emotional anguish. She couldn't bear the thought of watching any of her closest friends hurt in such a way. To think of a child of hers going through such tragedy made her physically ill. Her family may be dying out, but was that really such a consequence? Generations of royals had been humbled by this curse, and that humility had ensured what was best for the people was done. And although she may be God's blessed, no anti-jinx would stop this curse. Only a royal true of heart could end it. So this woman had said the day she'd cursed the royal family. The king and queen knew a darkness was in their eldest son, but they turned away. Only Gwynvale, eldest daughter and heir to the throne, did what needed to be done. She executed her twin for his crimes against their people. To ensure his soul did not rest, she courted him herself and sent the 4 quarters to the corners of the kingdom, and they were left for the prairie cats. Then Gwenvale mourned the rest of her life, foregoing all pleasures, marriage, or children. On her deathbed she became known as Gwenvale the Humble, for she truly became Queen of the People. Gwenvale's younger brother, Prince Nazin's son Tam, inherited the throne from his aunt Gwenvale, and still the curse stood. Each generation had less and less children, until there was just Mathilde and a distant cousin left. Clearly the royal family hadn't learned what needed to be learned to lift the curse. They had learned humility, how to listen to the people, but it was not good enough. The old witch observed the play of emotions on Mathilde's face and cackled.
I suppose, like your grandmother, you want to try to kill me now, lassie. Oh, don't be surprised I don't bother with the princes. They would never understand. Only princesses and queens could guess the riddle that I have been plaguing you with for years. And yet still you royals haven't learned your lesson. I heard you were promising, but I don't think you will lift my curse.
She slowly stood leaning on her cane, and turned to go inside the tent, dismissing Mathilde over her shoulder.
You might as well go and find someone to marry, girl. Maybe you'll have a daughter and she will be able to solve this curse. If not, it'll be the last of you royals.
Grandmother, I'm sorry, Mathilde's voice croaking in pain. The old woman stopped in the doorway of the tent, but didn't turn. Mathilde stood and went to kneel behind the woman, who then slowly turned to face the kneeling princess. Mathilde looked up to her, and took the old woman's frail hand as gently as possible when she turned to look at Mathilde. A tear rolled down the princess's face.
I can't imagine the pain you have felt for the loss of your child and the corruption of the royals. I cannot bring your daughter back nor take your suffering away as much as I would like to. I can only offer you my humblest apologies.
Mathilde stood and walked to her mare, wrapping her fingers around her mane. She swung in a practiced motion onto the mare's back. It was no small feat of strength to do such, but Mathilde's muscles burrowed beneath the plump body of a common woman. She looked at the old woman who watched her, still in the doorway.
I will do my duty by all my people, grandmother, and that includes you. There's no need for you to reside so far from our people, your people. I will send men to help you move into the village where you can be helped through the winters. I look forward to seeing you again. Good day, and the harvest goddess's blessing, grandmother.
Her mare turned, and in a whisper of a thought, Mathilde went cantering back to the village. She acknowledged greetings from the herders as they rode out to check their animals. Mathilde swung off her mare at the stables, quickly running brushes over her before sending her out to graze around the village. Still thinking of the old woman, Mathilde went to the large house of the Lady Wilda, because this was where court was held. It was one of the only full wooden buildings in the village. She waited in the foyer while a servant fetched the lady. Mathilde was ushered into her study.
Oh, are you hungry, princess? I could get some food brought from the kitchens.
Lady Wilda inquired, but Mathilde shook her head.
My lady, I was wondering if you had ever seen an elderly woman in the woods northeast of the village?
Wilda's look changed. She settled back in the high back chair and fumbled, looking down at her hands for a second before looking up with a hard look in her eyes.
Why would you ask, princess?
Mathilde explained meeting the woman in the woods and then asked,
Why is she not a part of the village? Well, princess, after Queen Gwenvale executed her brother Lyrden, the people assumed that all was well. Blood repaid. However, from the 6 remaining siblings of the queen, there were only 5 children born, which was unusual for a very fertile royal family. The woman had remained here with her son, but she never aged. Then after Queen Gwenvale, her nephew, and your great-grandfather, King Tam, was coronated. My grandfather ruled here, and when the king first passed through the village, the woman tried to talk to him about the curse, but was dismissed from his sight. Then in Tam's generation there was only 4, and those were children weak and sickly. It was then suspected. The woman's son died in a skirmish with the Northmen, and her tent disappeared overnight. She was never well liked around the village, but was bitter and cruel to those who were around her. We hadn't realized that she hadn't left to die until your grandmother came back furious from her confrontation with her in the woods. We searched for her, but couldn't find her. Anytime anyone tries to search for her, a great fog is cast over the land, preventing her from being found. Children and women stumble about her camp, but they are afraid of her and run away. She is exiled from our society.
Mathilde nodded in understanding.
I want you to send several men today to help her move back to the village if she chooses. If a fog occurs, you know not to bother.
but I wish her to be treated with the same respect you would give me, my lady. She is to have women help her with her laundry and harvesting." Wilda arched an eyebrow in surprise. "If it's not too presumptuous, Princess, but why?" she finally asked. "She should not have been punished for the crimes of the royals who were supposed to serve their people. She will live out her days in peace and comfort, as the befitting any elderly woman in our kingdom." Mathilde stood up and ruffled out the skirts of her gown. "Yes, Princess, but do you think this will make her drop her curse?" Lady Wilda asked as she stood and escorted Mathilde to the door. "Lady Wilda, curse is not as easily taken back as sweets from a child. Once a curse is made, it cannot be undone by the curse caster. It can only be lifted when the terms of the curse have been fulfilled." "Then that means—" Lady Wilda muttered hesitantly. "Yes, my lady, this woman is bound by her curse, as the royals are. We shall see what the years will bring, but whether or not the curse is cured, I am honored to serve my people in my greatest capacity possible." She then went to the royal tent, where Queen Mildred was waiting for her. The Queen demanded a high level of respect and etiquette. She was never not addressed as anything but Her Majesty. She was never not in some sort of formal wear, and Mathilde did not remember ever having a hug from her grandmother. Mathilde curtsied, then settled into a chair. "Your Majesty, before we begin today, I just want to tell you that I had an eventful ride today." The Queen had arched an eyebrow over a delicate teacup, from her own china set that travelled carefully packed with her, as she looked at her granddaughter. "Oh? Do tell." "I met the witch." Queen Mildred frowned delicately, her eyes confused until it dawned on her, and her eyes narrowed. "Oh, really? Did she give you her riddle?" "Nay, your Majesty, we didn't get to that. However, I did instruct Lady Wilda to send men to move her back into the village as her rightful place as an elder." Queen Mildred stiffened at her granddaughter's tone. No one had done anything without her explicit permission in an exceptionally long time. "I beg your pardon, Princess Mathilde, but who gave you that right?" "Because she should not be punished for the crimes of the royals of her time." Mathilde did not answer the questions but defended her decision with calm statements. "Who says it was a crime of a royal? She is nothing but a vengeful old woman too set in her ways to reverse her curse." "Grandma," Mathilde broke her protocol and leaned forward to take her grandmother's hand. "What if someone had raped and murdered your child, and she's not able to reverse her curse, Grandma? Curses once laid bind the curser until the curse has been lifted by those cursed. And one way or another, Prince Lyridon had raped and murdered multiple women before the witch cursed him. His own parents and Queen Gwainvale admitted to his crimes. So it's our fault for not being able to solve her riddle and break her curse. And we will have to make it up to her, or the royal family will die out." Queen Mildred gently pulled her hand from her granddaughter's and looked away, drumming angry fingers on their chair. "What does Lady Wilda have to say on this?" she finally asked. "I didn't give her an option, your Majesty. Amends must be made." Mathilde stared at her grandmother hard, not backing down. Queen Mildred ground her teeth in silent anger. "Fine, but you are responsible for her." Mathilde bowed her head. "Thank you, your Majesty." Queen Mildred flicked a hand in a sort of dismissal and acknowledgement. "Very good. Have you made any other consideration to the kingdom, sending their regards for your hand in marriage?" Mathilde knew her grandmother no longer wanted to speak of the matter, so she allowed the subject to be changed to a discussion of her future betrothal. Although a desert prince was being thought of, many kingdoms were still to be considered. Most interesting would be Adeline's brother Willard. Queen Mildred was not concerned. Mathilde could pick on her own in a few years, when she was of a better age to be married. She was too young now for thoughts of anything but betrothal. Their discussion was a quick one, the quickest yet because the queen was still upset, and soon enough she had dismissed Mathilde. Mathilde walked down to the horse corrals and leaned against the fence beside Aubrey to watch Celine. "How's it going?" she asked as Celine clung to the back of her horse and managed to turn him. "Oh, fine. He's still fighting her, but she's only fallen off twice." Aubrey and Mathilde giggled as the stallion stopped with his nose touching his rider's foot. "Why don't you talk to him?" Aubrey asked. Mathilde shrugged. "I have. He just enjoys this, so nothing I can do about it." Celine slid off his back before he could buck her off again, and then patted him on the neck and offered him an apple. The stallion nearly bit her fingers off taking his treat, and Celine took him from the pen. "That's it?" the hostler asked her. "You're barely in for 20 minutes."
Better to end on a good note,
Celine told him as she went to take care of her horse. Aubrey and Mathilde walked into the village to find some lunch from the large pot of stew in the main fire pit in the middle of the village. The festive was on full swing day and night, but there was still chores to be done. Prince Arkin stopped beside his daughter. "The Queen tells me you overstepped yourself today, my princess." Mathilde winced, looking up at him.
I don't think I did, Papa. I just am trying to right a wrong.
"I know, Poppet. I'm riding out now to retrieve her. We shall see if a fog covers the land." No matter what, she had never seen this kind eyes not full of love. In that she was always blessed. Although other kingdoms were inherited based off of gender, the Heartlands inherited of the firstborn child, and the Heartlands queens had always been knowing of being the strongest of leaders. When Mathilde had been born, Arkinen had thanked the goddess for her blessing of his daughter. She would be a great queen to follow him after he took the crown from his mother upon her death. The six blessed with Fidelius for training with the royal army. He divided them into groups to customize their practice. He only did military precision and intense exercises with Aubrey, Celine, and Niall. Other days, they all trained together to learn to fight together in preparation for the wars to come. They all joked that each of them had a different part in the war to come. Celine would be the hothead in the middle, slaughtering anyone in their way. Mathilde and the animals with her. Niall would be in a magical battle. Evelyn would step silently and assassinate everyone in her way. Adeline in the healing tent, and Aubrey would be a knight fighting with honor and valor. It was a plan they wanted to see carried to fulfillment, to fight together, defend each other to the death. It was the dreams of the innocent, who never thought of anything bad. That night the celebration was in full, and once again they were dancing about the fire. As young preteen and teenagers would do, and Mathilde looked around, feeling eyes upon her. At the very edge of the fire, by herself, stood the witch, leaning on her cane. Mathilde beamed at her, then dragged Adeline around the fire. Curious, the others followed.
Grandmother, I'm so happy that you accepted my offer and came to stay with us. Allow me to introduce you to my friends. This is Adeline, Aubrey, Celine, Evelyn, and Niall. Everyone, this is... Uh, oh, I'm so sorry, Grandmother. I don't know what you prefer to be called.
Mathilde blushed. The blessed bowed and curtsied to the old woman. The old witch looked bemused at the blessed in front of her. She swirled her tongue around one of her good teeth left.
I no longer respond to my name as is. You may call me Grandmother. It is rather amusing,
she informed the group.
Grandmother, it is a pleasure,
Adeline told her with a genuine smile upon her face.
Indeed, Princess, I can tell that. Has Mathilde told you who I am? Of course, Grandmother,
Evelyn replied demurely.
We don't hide anything from each other,
Niall claimed with a grin.
But we all agree,
Celine continued with a bored drawl,
that we would do the same thing,
Aubrey pointed out, and then shrugged.
So we can't rightfully hate you because we aren't hypocritical,
Evelyn finished, and they all smiled at the grandmother. She arched a deep eyebrow, bemused.
Quite.
With the next beat of the drums, they excused themselves to dance. The witch watched them with a deep amount of consideration.
Perhaps hope still lives,
she muttered to herself, and then turned and slowly hobbled from the fire as people moved quickly from her way. From that time on, the festive was spent in a blur of parties and training. The witch watched the blessed as they continued their education over the following weeks, and without fail, Mathilde or her father always made sure that she was left with enough food, fresh bread, and milk, and slowly, because of their support, others began to help her out as well. She still spent time alone, but she did enjoy her alone time. She could sit now outside her hut and watch the village bustle, smoking her pipe and think of the past. It consumed her. It didn't take too long before Celine's horse began to allow her to stay on, and with Mathilde's help, the stallion was able to be used in mock battles. He was vicious and mean still, and Celine loved it. Mathilde had to explain to him that this was all in practice as he got too aggressive too quickly, but Celine loved every buck, rear, bite, and every charge. She named him Boldness, Boldy for short. Adeline and Evelyn learnt many tricks from the nomad healers. Aubrey began to train with the knights of the nomads. Niall sat with the village elders and shamans, and he asked many questions, mostly of the mythical creatures and the legends of the Heartlands. His reasoning was that one could not defeat the one god without knowing how to best utilize the power against him. Celine and Mathilde spent the time buried in animals. It was one of the last nights and the night of the full moon and the largest party that Celine snuck into her horse's pen. He snorted and came to her, accepting one of her many treats.
Ready, Boldness? Let's go a-runnin'.
Quickly she saddled him and slipped on a bridle. Then she was on his back as he galloped away from the herds through the fields to the mountains. She pulled him up when she felt him breathing hard and patted him on the side of the neck.
Wait, Boldy, I got a surprise for you.
They rode into a quiet small portion of an apple orchard. She swung down, then pulled off his saddle and his bridle to allow him to graze. Flopping in the deep grass in the middle of the orchard, she looked at the stars. Because of their training and Mathilde's intervention, she knew he would never leave her. She was just enjoying being by herself, allowing herself to worry about heading on a ship to Dala to see her relatives. She feared being around them. She didn't want to be a disappointment. "Why are you alone?" Luca's voice asked, and Celine squealed, flames shooting around her, Boldness charging. Only Celine's safe word stopped the stallion, though he still struck out towards Luca with his front hoof. Celine closed her fingers, and the flames died.
What are you doing here?
Celine asked as he flopped onto the ground beside her, his own mare now occupying Boldness's attention.
I saw you ride out and thought you might want company.
Celine hesitated.
Not really. I wanted some alone time.
Worried about meeting your family? Celine glared at him and nodded jerkily. Why? You're God's blessed. No one can hurt you. Celine laughed.
I can be hurt, but not killed. And do you know how hard it is not being accepted by your family? The people who are supposed to love you?
Luca hesitated. I never thought of it that way. But they love your mother. They love you too. Celine stared at the stars, fighting back tears and fears.
Why? I'm nothing like her. She's sweet and genteel. I'm not that.
Yeah, but you're more than that. Fire and passion, laughter and life. They'll love you for everything you are. Celine chuckled wetly. Luca reached out to touch her cheek and turned her towards him so he could study her purple eyes. He smiled at her. If only you could see how much people like you for you. He leaned in to place his lips over hers. Celine froze, uncertain what to do as his tongue brushed across her bottom lip. Hesitantly, she kissed him back, and he responded with a low moan and scooted closer to deepen their kiss as she opened her mouth to his. It took quite some time for Celine and Luca to return to the party, and when they did, it was separately and with the utmost discretion. It was the peak of the festival, the harvest moon, and the celebrating of the harvest goddess. Magic ran high in the air, passion and lust peaked, and even the non-magical could feel it, which meant the magical were drowning in it. Adeline danced with Evelyn and Aubrey, learning the beats of the primal drum. They had been promised that if they behaved themselves they could stay up late into the night. However, it wasn't long until they could see Niall being marched to his bed by a perturbed Owen.
They got one being bad,
Evelyn whispered over their mental bond as she caught the eyes of Aubrey and Adeline. Niall had merely been drinking, sneaking off with the boys, and some pilfered strong wine. However, they could also feel how Celine had had a lustful night of kissing with the strutting Luca who was once again with his friends by the fire. The girls smiled at each other as they repeated the steps of the dance. Celine joined them as soon as she was cooled down from her encounter in the woods. She avoided the gaze of Luca. Mathilde was amongst her people, laughing and listening. She had spent the day in the political courts with the Queen, but unlike her grandmother, who never really socialized, she and her father spread amongst the people with ease. She spoke to all, young and old, on all matters, and where she walked happiness bloomed amongst her people. Arkin was too cheerful, but Mathilde was a combination of Mildred and Arkin, and a little dash of herself. Sweet and kind, born of duty, and yet humble to her very core. Mathilde was turning towards the fire when she caught sight of a figure by herself. Mathilde brightened and weaved her way towards the figure.
Grandmother, are you comfortable in your dwelling?
As old and bent over she was, the witch was still taller than Mathilde. She squinted at Mathilde.
It's fine, but it was unnecessary. I think once you and your father have left, the village will shun me again. We shall see about that.
Turning, Mathilde summoned Luca to her with a wave. He bowed to them both. Your Majesty, Grandmother, I am Lord Luca, Lady Wilda's eldest child and heir. I welcome you to our village.
Wilda, eh? She tried to hunt my home many times. Always failed,
cackled the old woman with a hooting laughter. Luca and Mathilde laughed with her. Aye, grandmother, it drove her mad, especially when our village stayed hidden in mist for days, and no one could travel in or out. The witch smiled, engaged in conversation with the young Luca.
I knew that. It's been years since her last attempt to find me. Perhaps she actually learned her lesson.
Perhaps, grandmother. With age comes wisdom after all, Luca said, and the witch laughed, showing off her few good teeth to him. To give Luca credit, he didn't flinch at all.
Yes, but one misses the beauty of youth.
And she ran her eyes over Luca in a nearly leering fashion. Luca once again didn't flinch, though Mathilde would have.
Grandmother, I wanted to introduce the two of you because I cannot stay here much longer. I want you to have the life deserving of you as a village elder. Luca is going to ensure that happens in my absence. He will ensure you get the best slaughter, that your hut is always supplied with firewood, and he will escort you as often as you wish to your daughter's grave, and will keep you or help you upkeep it in my absence, if that is acceptable to you.
Mathilde reached out to hold the witch's hand. She squeezed it tight and searched her bright blue eyes. The witch's eyes for once didn't hold a gleam of mischief or bitterness. Surprise held in her mind as she studied Mathilde.
What does a queen need to be the best for her people? This is the riddle I have given all before you, but none have solved.
Mathilde couldn't answer, and the witch waved them both off. Mathilde had no time to ponder the witch's riddle, for Niall, who had snuck out of the tent, yanked her into the dancing circle, and the blessed began to chant. Slowly the Heartlands dancers faded back as the drums became frenzied. As they chanted, the drums became louder. The beat echoed in the blood of the people. A strong, bold people. The Heartlanders clapped and stamped their feet as they watched the six spun around the circle. The fire leapt and bound, dancing higher and higher in the night. When each of them put their palms up, pure energy pulsed between them and rolled out to touch the people. The song, the drums, and the souls of all. It was ecstasy. Not in the sexual terms, but the pure, raw, unadulterated power and presence. In that moment, the Heartlanders felt safe from the dark, the whispers of what was to come. These six gods blessed were the future. In the strength of their bonds and loyalty to one another, it seemed in that moment the troubles of the past and future were minuscule, and the witch watched it all with a narrowed eye and a twinkling thoughtfulness in her soul.